Data collection methods. Depending on the objectives of the study, the approach, and the methodology, researchers employ a variety of methods to collect data. The following are the most important ones. Some other methods do exist depending on the discipline. Let's begin with interviews. An interview is a method of data collection which makes use of oral questions. The aim is to elicit from the respondents oral answers on precise topics, which are related to the research problem, of course, in the form of a conversation. The researcher who uses interviewing is considered a miner or a traveler, since interviews are specially designed to search profoundly into various phenomena from the perspective of individuals. In addition, interviews are distinguished by interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. It is conducted for a specific research purpose, for instance, to acquire knowledge about a certain topic or some sphere of human experience. Interviews are used in some types of research because they have some advantages. Firstly, the interview permits researchers to examine unobservable phenomena such as beliefs and opinions, and perceptions and attitudes. Secondly, interviews can generate supplementary or additional data if initial information is not sufficient. This is especially done in mixed methods research. A further advantage is that interviews can make respondents more comfortable to provide complete answers using the conversational mode. Conversation is very important to make people feel comfortable. Also, interviews make a room for the use of the respondent's first language, and this would reduce the effect that lack of proficiency can have on the quantity and the quality of the data gathered. Finally, interviews are characterized by depth. They provide deep and profound information in the treatment of observed phenomena. For these reasons, interviews are sometimes preferred, and they are suitable for some types of research, while they are not suitable for other types. This depends on the research paradigm. Interviews are not done in the same way. There are types of interviews. Here we can distinguish three types: the structured interview, the semi-structured interview, and the unstructured interview. Three types. This depends on one issue. It is whether their content or the questions which are included are controlled in advance by the researcher or not. We mean here whether they are prepared in advance by the researcher or not. In the case of the structured interview, we'll see that it is the most controlled type. The researcher prepares a list of questions before the interview and then asks a number of individuals the same set of questions. The purpose is to gather their responses to the same questions. It is in this way that this interview is structured. When the answers are collected, the researcher can evaluate the responses related to specific topics. It is important to say that structured interviews are similar to questionnaires or surveys. The succession, it means the sequence and phrasing, the wording of the questions are determined by means of a schedule prepared beforehand. The interview schedule means the list of questions prepared in advance. Here we notice that little freedom is left to the interviewer to make changes or to add questions. In the schedule, the researcher can use a number or various types of questions. They can be, for example, fixed alternative items, like yes or no questions, agree, disagree questions, and so on. Also, the researcher can use open-ended items, here WH questions. Another option is to use scales of fixed alternatives like strongly agree, agree, or undecided, disagree, strongly disagree. This is a scale because it has degrees. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages of these types of questions. The choice is left to the researcher. Now we come to the second type of interviews, which is the semi-structured interview. This type includes a few predetermined main questions. However, the researcher has the freedom to digress or probe for more information by asking additional questions which are not prepared before. These are called probes. Here some answers may lead the researcher to think of other possible details that might increase his or her understanding of certain phenomena from the perspective of the respondents themselves. It is in this way that this type of interview is semi-structured. This means that the questions are partly controlled by the researcher and prepared beforehand, while some set of questions are not prepared. This aspect of semi-structured interviews adds flexibility to the predetermined categories, while allowing researchers to follow up on ambiguous or imprecise responses by adding further why and how questions. These are, as I said, called probes. The last type of interviews is the unstructured interview. This type of interview is the most flexible type of interview because they are completely open. That is to say, the researcher does not prepare questions before. The researcher announces the main issue to be discussed, then follows the course of the interview, focusing on interesting topics and stimulating or encouraging the interview to say more through questions that are not prepared before. Of course, all the questions should guide the interviewer in order not to talk about unrelated topics. Unstructured interviews are very, very flexible. They allow the participants to express their own views, that is to say, to have their own categories. They can discuss topics that are significant to themselves, rather than reacting to topics anticipated or predicted by the researcher in advance. Unstructured interviews are richer, but they are more difficult to use and to analyze. They are more difficult to use because the researcher should be able to control the conversation. And they are very difficult to analyze because the researcher does not have predetermined categories and he has to find the categories to discover them by himself. Now we come to talk about the disadvantages of using interviews. Although interviews serve in gathering very profound data or rich data, they have a number of drawbacks. The first is that they are prolonged. Therefore, researchers must reduce the number of participants. I mean here that in case you are using an interview, it's not necessary to have a large number of participants, because having a large number of participants will make the analysis huge, the data huge, and the analysis extremely difficult. The second disadvantage is that interviews may involve bias. They may involve bias, or the researcher here can influence the interviewee. Interviewers must be cautious to lessen their manipulation of respondents. They should not manipulate the respondents by using leading questions or showing that some responses are preferred rather than other responses. We mean here by bias is that the researcher leads the interviewee to choose a particular response rather than another and restrict their freedom of answers. The third disadvantage is related to research ethics. In the case of interviewing, interviews do not permit the interview any anonymity. In that case, the interviewee is known to the researcher. The name is not hidden. Researchers should be aware of these disadvantages. Interview steps. Conducting interviews can be done face-to-face, on the phone, or via email. These are recognized forms, although the face-to-face form is more common. Of course, with the advancement of communication technologies, more forms are recognized, such as online interviews. The act of interviewing needs some skills on the part of the researcher. These skills are conversational skills, in fact. Without acquiring these skills, using an interview may completely fail. That's why the researcher should learn about the steps of conducting interviews. They should follow, in fact, some steps to optimize the outcomes of interviewing. Step 1 is selecting respondents and arranging interviews. The selection of the respondents is done via choosing certain sampling strategies, arranging the interviews, arranging the date of the interview, the time and the place. The researcher should have appointments with the interviewees, and he should select a place where there is less noise. The second step is drafting questions and the interview guide. Here some researchers or some people use the term guide instead of the term schedule. The researcher should be very careful in drafting the questions. The questions should not be ambiguous. The outline of the topics to be covered, the topics that will be covered by the interview, should be well defined before the interview, and the researcher should bear in mind his research questions, so that he gathers data that will enable him to answer the questions, and he should avoid gathering irrelevant data. The order of the questions, in case the researcher is using a structured or semi-structured interview, is very important, and this should be fixed before interviewing the respondents. Step 3 is conducting the interview. Interviewers should be professional, and they should establish good rapport with the interviewee. This is done to gain their trust. The researcher should use an acceptable degree of formality. I don't mean that the conversation will be highly formal or highly informal, but the researcher should control the degree of formality and should make the interviewee feel comfortable. The researcher should always keep in mind that he or she should be professional. Another aspect of this step is related to seeking the respondents' permission on whether they will use recording or alternative tools. Ethically, if you will be recording the speech of the interviewee, you should gain their permission beforehand. You should also gain their permission regarding any device to record the answers, such as the booklets, electronic tablets, laptops, computers, or smaller notebook computers. Finally, the researcher should ensure that the answers of the participants will be confidential, and this should be explicitly said to the participants.